Okay, so Corona Diary, Jerusalem, day a lot. As you can tell from the background noise, that I'm in my house on Memorial Day in Israel, just like everybody else is. So this is going to have a high degree of difficulty for me to say, and maybe a higher degree of difficulty for you to listen to. But it was something that was kind of felt was important to me. I've been thinking a lot about theodicy. I'm teaching Milton, and Milton writes a theodicy. In fact, although Leibniz later on, he wrote a book called Theodicy. He's the one who coins the phrase. Milton really defines it when he says at the end of the invocation, he calls out to the muse, and at the end of that, he says that he's going to justify the ways of God to man. And in that sense, the poem announces itself as having this pedagogical mission, and that pedagogical mission is to justify the ways of God to man. Why do God's ways need to be justified? Because of the appearance, or not of the appearance, the experience of evil. How is it, this is really the way the question goes, how is it that on the one hand, God is understood to be all good, and yet, there is a force of evil in the world? So a early a way of dealing with this issue, and this was among the contemporaries of Augustine, was to say really there are two forces in the world. There's a force of good and there's a force of evil. So now, if I'm a philosopher and I'm understanding or positing a perfect God, and the perfect God is all good, well, I fulfilled that condition, but I've run into another problem. The problem is now God is not God is not all powerful. So that's kind of the schema of the philosophical bind, about which philosophers and theologians have written endlessly. In a way, it's an unsolvable problem. And I think it's certainly, and I was looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia to try to understand Leibniz, and I'm like, what? I mean, it's written by philosophers, and Leibniz, of course, was a philosopher. And part of it was I just couldn't follow it because I don't have the philosophical languages or the discipline. But I'm so used to Milton, and Milton's attempt at theodicies is through poetry, which I think has a chance of being successful. More on that in a bit. While philosophers, I think, are stuck in the bind of not being contradictory, that poets can sometimes get around either through paradox, or through, as I think in Milton's case, maintaining multiple different perspectives on time, which allows him to not solve the problem, but at least to deal with it in a way which is not completely contradictory. I was thinking yesterday that after reading The Will to Power and where Nietzsche is proclaiming the death of God, and that's a complicated proclamation in and of itself. I think the death of God is the death of a particular Christian God. But I was thinking that it's not God that is dead, but rather it's poetry, because poetry is the means through which we can start to understand these ideas. I said recently that those who most vigorously question theodicy are in a way codependents of the people who most vigorously defend it. The people who most vigorously defend it are those who have a very clear idea of why things happen in the world. There's a fire in the north, it's because there was a gay pride march. There's coronavirus, well, women are not wearing modest clothing, whatever. It's sometimes more nuanced than that, or more complicated than that, but it comes down really to being able to know or explain why things happen, and to say that everything is for the good. Another reason Milton's theodicy works so well is because it does accommodate the experience of the human. And even though everything is, in the end, from some perspective, good, when one is in the middle, things are not always good. And Milton does not try to erase that human experience, and bad theodicy erases that experience. So the people who oppose theodicy are those people, for example, somebody who came to me and said, you're a religious person. How is it that God does this? And people come, one cannot undermine or question the psychological dispositions of people who are coming from the experience of evil or the experience of death or the experience of trauma, which makes their question more urgent than it is for others. And it might make it less likely for them to find any argument compelling about the nature of evil. And I understand that. But there's also that knee-jerk reaction, which is it can't be that God exists because of the Holocaust or because of the coronavirus. And I think implicit in that is almost a beseeching, that is, please convince me that there is a simple answer. That is, I think both sides, those who vigorously make these arguments, and we're talking in Israel about the ultra-Orthodox, a theological elite who vigorously make these arguments in the public sphere. Of course, they've been silent a lot lately because they were so blindsided by Corona, and it really refused their narratives. But we know the type, and it's been in the newspaper. Not only Orthodox Jews, but fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist Muslims find ways of understanding the coronavirus in a very simple way and explaining why all of this fits in a divine scheme. Then there are those others who argue against the simplicity of that scheme. And as I was saying, I think implicit in that is, please convince me that that's the case. Please give me a simple answer. And I think what gets lost in this discussion between opposing codependence, and I really do see it this way as opposing codependence, is a refusal to deal with any kind of complexity. So I'm reading Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, and I thought a passage from his work could be a way into answering some of these questions. Mann writes Joseph and His Brothers between 1933 and 1943, Hitler's rise to power. I think in the late 30s, he went on a holiday to Amsterdam and he realized that he could not go back home. He settled in America and he finished the end of Joseph and His Brothers, which was written in California. And Mann writes in the preface that when he thought of Joseph, he imagined him as a kind of FDR figure. Joseph is the great provider in Egypt. He thought him as a kind of FDR figure administering the New Deal. And Joseph is, that's what Joseph is very, very clearly in Mann's extended midrash, and that's really what this is. Just like Milton's Paradise Lost is an extended midrash meaning filling in the blanks of a story that's well known. Mann's is also an extended midrash. What's fascinating about both Milton and Mann, and the midrash itself, is that their commentary is a form of poetry. And that's how Mann, Milton, and the writers of the midrash work. They write poetry about poetry. So one might think, well, that makes things even more at a remove. Why not use the clear language of criticism instead of writing poetry? And I think the answer is because poetry in some sense provides a better picture. I almost said more accurate, and that's exactly not the case. Poetry is not more accurate because poetry does not aim for that. As Philip Sidney said 500 years ago, the poet never affirmeth, and therefore the poet never lies. The poet never says anything to be true, and he also never lies. Because there's not that criteria of scientific accuracy under which everybody, including people in the religious world, are suffering. Why are they suffering? Because that criteria of scientific accuracy over everything else has rendered poetry second class. And this is true even though in the Jewish world, going back really 1,500 years, there are those who praise midrash and say you really can't understand halakha, you can't understand Jewish law unless you have an understanding of midrash, or one complements the other. Nonetheless, in the yeshiva world today, midrash is completely overlooked. Maybe somebody will throw a bone to the idea that midrash is important, but it's almost never interpreted or taken seriously. Because I think that's because A, it's hard, and B, people don't have a poetic sensibility anymore. And in order to understand God, you have to have a poetic sensibility. And as I was saying before, it's not that God that died, it's poetry. So Mann is writing poetry as commentary, just like the Midrash's poetry is commentary. It involves a set of complicated interpretive lenses through which we can see the story that we thought we were reading. Meaning, we thought we were reading a fairy tale, and that's what the peddlers of theodicy and B'nai Brak and Mea Shearim are giving us. We thought we were reading theodicy, but really we're just reading a fairy tale. That's what we found out, and that's what commentary does. Commentary tells you that what you thought you understood as being the story was really just the pretext for this set of stories. I mean, I'm saying it much more strongly than some perhaps would say, that the fairy tale, and Mann refers to the story that he's telling about Joseph as a kind of fairy tale, or no, the story that is inherited from the authoritative sources. He very, very rarely says the Bible. That has a kind of status for him as a fairy tale, but that fairy tale is rendered alive, is given life by the commentaries that explain it, by the midrashim that explain it. The commentaries, but I went further, the commentaries where the story, the fairy tale, exists as that pretext for the poetry of commentary. Think also of Passover. We say, on behalf of this, God took us out of Egypt. And Rashi says that God took you out of Egypt so that you could sit at this table today and tell the story. So again, that's a version of what Mann says. Really, there's fairy tale, and then there's the commentary. And the commentary is really the way we live. The Passover Seder is the commentary. And here, our lives, in a way, another talk, can be a commentary on those fairy tales, on those authoritative sources. So here's Mann, going back to theodicy. So what's going on here? So some of Mann's best characters are the ones that he makes up. So Joseph, he enlists the prison guard who takes care of him when he's thrown down, or yet again thrown down into the pit, as it were, when he's sent into prison for seducing, as it were, Potiphar's wife. And he enlists the prison guard, who is very kind to him, to be his administrator, kind of to be his right-hand man in Egypt. And they're trying to come up with this idea together about how to further the story with the brothers. And they both simultaneously come up with this idea of calling them spies. According to the text itself, Joseph sees when the brothers come, he accuses them of being spies. And here we are. Then one of them says, I guess, Mai, who is the overseer, or Joseph's right-hand man, then we both came up with the same idea. And Joseph continues, of course, because it is the only right one, and might as well already be written down. This whole story has already been written, Mai, in God's book, and we shall read it together amid laughter and tears. Wow, just it's really all there. The whole story has been written, which of course begs the question: if the whole story has been written, well, then what is the role of the individual? How can Joseph tell his story? Is Joseph just a passive agent in the story, or does Joseph have a role in the story? And how do you that's really the question. How do you have a role in a story if it's already been written? And one of the reasons we bristle at the idea of theodicy is we don't want to be in somebody else's story. Satan in Paradise Lost, that's his problem, as it were. He does not want to be in God's story. I want to be my own storyteller. In some ways, Satan is the first novelist. He's writing in the first person, and he wants to break out of that framework in which God is the author of all things. I love this part also, and we shall read it together amid laughter and tears. Laughter and tears. For you do intend to be part of it yourself, don't you? See, Mann is hilarious at the same time that he's so profound. Here, Joseph is asking Mai, you're going to be part of the story. And the simple meaning is, right, you're going to help. But of course, as we read this paragraph, you want to be part of this divine story. You want to be part of God's story. Mann also tells the story of Tamar, and he puts it right here. And that's interesting how it comes in the Bible pretty much. And Tamar desperately wants to be part of the story that Jacob's family has begun. In Mann's version, Tamar spends hours and hours at Jacob's knees listening to him tell stories, and she wants to be part of that story. To join me at the office when they arrive tomorrow or the day after, and are brought before me in the hall of the provider, whose walls are filled with Happy's image. You are part of my entourage, of course. I must have a grand entourage for the reception. Here he's telling his servant, you are part of the story. Amai. The man who had been raised up so high now exclaimed, covering his face with his hands, the same hands that whelp Benoni, Benjamin, had once watched to weave a wreath of myrtle in the grove of the god, and one of which now bore Pharaoh's ring of sky blue lapis that read, be as I am, I shall see them, my family, my own. Sorry. So first Joseph is described in this way from his humble origins, Benjamin, and with Benjamin weaving that wreath of myrtle, and also then having that sky blue lapis of the Pharaoh that says, be as I am. I shall see them, my family, my own, for they were always that, no matter how bad things were between us for a while, for which we all share the blame. Joseph as hero. Joseph as hero because Joseph is willing to forgive. I shall speak with them, with the sons of Jacob, my brothers. I shall hear whether my father is still alive, before whom I had to remain silent in death for so long, and whether he can still hear that I am alive, and that God has accepted the animal in place of the son. One more time. Before whom I had to remain silent in death for so long. A lot of similarities with Odysseus. Aside from both of them having a scar, Odysseus in the boar hunt and Jacob with the angel, or the Tsar, the minister of Esau. And then this homecoming. Odysseus prevented from coming home, and Jacob and Joseph in some sense thinks that he is prevented, he can't. Well, we might ask Joseph, why so long? Before whom I had to remain silent in death for so long, and whether he can still hear that I'm alive. On the one hand, it sounds like, well, maybe he's just asking whether his father is still alive, but he's already said that. So whether he can still hear that I am alive means, is there a space in his mind or in his experience to accommodate me anymore? Can I still be my father's son after all this time? Can he still hear that I am alive? And that God has accepted the animal in place of the son. In Mann's version, Jacob daydreams that he sacrifices Joseph in a way that's parallel to Abraham sacrificing Isaac. I shall hear it all and learn from them how Benjamin lives and whether they have treated him as a brother. And they shall have to bring him to me and father as well. Oh, my good taskmaster, who is now my steward, it is all too exciting and festive. And the feast is to be observed with every high delight and amusement. For high delight, my friend, and the subtle jest are the best that God gave us. The profoundest knowledge we have of this complicated, equivocal life. A sentence that you have to read and reread and reread, because that's the nature of poetic language, that it is not transparent, that it is not accurate, that it requires interpretation, that it requires thought, that it won't work in simple theodicies. The Bible is poetic. It's so strange that there's this inability to read poetry when all of the sacred writings in the Jewish tradition are poetic, as are and now I'm talking about the written Torah, but also the oral Torah. The Talmud is a poetic text, and people don't know how to read. For high delight, my friend, and the subtle jest. If somebody knows German, I'm sure it would be great to find out what words Mann is using, what their connotations are, to fill this in for us. The translator, I'm sure, has a hard job. For high delight, my friend, and the subtle jest are the best that God gave us. The best thing to do is to laugh, to feel delight. And it itself is the profoundest knowledge we have of this complicated, equivocal life. We don't have jest and high delight because we look askance or turn away from what makes our lives equivocal, but precisely because of what makes them equivocal. I think earlier on, when Mai and Joseph are talking, Joseph says, when my brothers come, I'm going to forgive them. And Mai says, you mean the brothers that ripped you to shreds and ripped your coat to shreds and nearly killed you and left you there to die? Meaning, Mann puts in our face that Joseph is forgiving his brothers with all of this in mind. For high delight, my friend, in the face of that, our attitude is high delight and subtle jest, for they are the best that God gave us and the profoundest knowledge we have of this complicated, equivocal life. God gave it to our spirits so that we might make this stern life laugh. That my brothers mutilated me and threw me into the pit, and that they shall now be standing before me, that is life. And life is also the question of whether one should judge the deed by its consequence and so call what is evil good, because it was necessary for a good result. So what is Mann asking here? Well, let's say, as Joseph does in the text, Joseph says it's really all for the good. And life is also the question, my being sold, my going down to Egypt, my being in prison, everything has led to this moment. And from that point of view, the act that your original act, throwing me in the pit and selling me, even though from some perspective, obviously evil, has been now assimilated into this other narrative in which it becomes good. But he asked that as a question. A life is also the question of whether one should judge the deed by its consequence and so call what is evil good because it was necessary for a good result. Mann, are there two questions here? Life is also the question. Okay, so that's just the one question. I thought maybe there were two. And life is also the question of whether one should judge the deed by its consequence and so call what is evil good because it was necessary for a good result. Or do we look at it from the perspective in which it happened, in which it was evil and cruel and heartless is not strong enough, murderous, vicious, violent? But Mann, like I was saying of Milton before, does not erase that. That is the question. That is the question. And the answer implicit in that question is that it has to always be both. Because the question remains unanswered. It's both that story that we read and bad theologians promulgate, everything's for the good. But it's also that story where we as individuals, where humans experience evil, and that's not erased here. Those are the questions that life poses. One cannot answer them with a long face. The human spirit can rise above them only in serene delight, so that in its own profound amusement over what is unanswerable, it may move God himself, the great unanswering God, to laughter. Guys, please. I'm making a videotape, guys. Yeah, so let's just go back to that. One cannot answer them with a long face. Meaning, if you answer it with a long face, what happens then? If you answer it with a long face, then you only feel that suffering. You spiral down into suffering. You remain in the pit. The human spirit can rise above them only in serene delight, so that in its own profound amusement over what is unanswerable, it may move God himself, the great unanswering God, the great unanswering God, to laughter. So serene delight is seeing the past, narrating the past, as bad as it was for Joseph, and he's able to do that for good. Not being in the pit also means for Joseph being able to forgive. When the butler leaves the pit, he tells Joseph, or Joseph asks him to remember me to Pharaoh. And the butler immediately forgets about it. Because in a certain sense, he maybe always remains in the pit. And he has no sense of obligation to anybody but himself. The human spirit can rise above them only in serene delight, so that in its own profound amusement over what is unanswerable, profound amusement, I assume that goes up to what's before that, profound knowledge. It may move God himself, the great unanswering God, to laughter. I see that, and I'm still reading that as just a riddle, the way this passage ends. You are part of another story. And maybe that's where that delight comes from, to know that you are a part of another story, no matter how bad it is. You are part of it. Here, when Joseph, or here where I mentioned before, Tamar sitting at Joseph's knees, and here Mann describes that. This once upon a time was still very fresh, and Jacob's voice quavered as he spoke, whereas he had been relaxed in telling the grand epic of earlier and earliest once is now covered by time. He gets more emotional when he talks about himself. Had worn an expression of solemn joy, even for what was grim and heavy. For they were all God's stories, and their telling was holy. And that's what Mann seems to be saying. That the telling of the story itself is a holy act. Being part of a story through telling it is itself a holy act. But it is quite certain, and it could never have been otherwise, and it must be noted, that Tamar's listening soul was nourished in instruction by more than the once that lay covered beneath time and history, the holy once upon a time. Once is an unlimited word and has two faces. It looks back, far back, into sublimely dusky distances, and it looks ahead, far ahead, into distances no less sublime for being what is yet to come than those others are for having been. Some will deny this. For them, only the once of the past is sublime, that of the future contemptible. They display piousness, not piety, are fools and gloomy souls. Jacob did not sit in their church. The people who stopped telling stories that are not only relevant to the past, but also to the future. Our storytelling is not only about the past, it's also about the future. When the brothers come to Joseph, and Joseph is still disguised, the brothers talk about their father, and Joseph looks disdainfully at them, telling them that they're not taking requisite care of Jacob. And he says to them, have you no learning? Have you no stories? Meaning for Jacob and for Mann, learning is in the story, so you don't give them up. And the real story is not one that just goes into the past. Those are for gloomy people, and Jacob does not sit in their church. If to future ones one does not honor pay, one has to the ones of the past no future words to say. It's rhyming here. And likewise, one surely standeth toward the now of today. One more time. If to futures once one does not honor pay, you don't think about the future. One has to the once of the past no further words to say. It's only through the future past. It's only through the future that the past comes alive. Freud writes, Where id was, ego shall be, which means where your past was, where your desire was, there shall be, there shall stand your self. The ego becomes herself by going back into her past and accommodating that past. And what's left out of that Freudian formula is that past is read by the present through the lens of the future. That past, I'll say that again, that past is read by the present from the point of view of an imagined or ideal future. Mann's once here. This is our doctrinal opinion. If we may interpolate it into the doctrines that Yaakov ben Yitzchak shared with Tamar and that were filled with the twofold ones. And how could they not be? Since he was telling her about the world, and the world's word is in fact once both his tidings and his promise. She might well say to him in gratitude, indeed did say it, my Lord, you have paid too little attention to telling me tidings about what has happened, and have spoken instead to your handmaid about tidings of the future. For he did so quite automatically, since in all his stories an element of promise was present from the very beginning, so that one could not give tidings of one without the other. That's the serene delight about which Joseph speaks. It's remembering the two meanings of once. And even if in the once upon a time there's that equivocation, that equivocal life, there still is that promise. Right after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, the narrator, Mann, says, you may think you may want to put the book down here because this is what you've been waiting for. You've been waiting 1,400 pages for this revelation. But he says, no, there's the best is yet to come. And in a way, he's echoing Jacob here. With divine stories, the best is always yet to come. And when Jacob says to his brothers, don't you have any learning? Don't you have any stories? Why aren't you living an ethical life? Why aren't you treating your father properly? It's because stories give you the past and they give you the present as well. And they give you the future. And it's through that future ideal, that aspiration to a promise. And in Mann, it's the unstated promise of, it's never of the exodus from Egypt and the forming of the Jewish people. Remember, all of this is happening. So, Jacob goes down and goes up, so the people of Israel can go down. That's where Mann, I haven't got finished it yet, but that's where Mann ends, where the people of Israel are down and are about to be enslaved. There's no genius of the story that the triumph of the story ends with the beginning of suffering, just like in a way Milton's Paradise Lost, which begins with suffering and evil and death and human life. And also at the end of Paradise Lost, it ends with Adam and Eve going out into the world. It ends at the beginning. And in some sense, Joseph also ends at the beginning. Because and no matter how difficult that beginning is, there's always that possibility of a future. Bad theologians not only fill our minds with nonsense and tell us that theodicy, if not answered simply, can't be answered at all, they also tell us that we don't have our own stories because there's this authorized one. The authorized story is the one that we tell you. We'll save you the trouble of reading. Here, the reading is not reading text, it's reading history. I can't read my reading of my justifying the ways of God to man, if I'm doing that, or my aspirational future defining a past which is ambivalent, will be very different from somebody else's. Especially in the former story of thinking about the way, how does God exist in a world where there is so much evil? The way I tell that story is going to be very different than from those people who suffered real, genuine trauma and evil, from those people who lived through the Holocaust, from those people who lose loved ones. Today's Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, is much easier. Don't be an armchair theologian. Being an armchair theologian means being it for somebody else. Sit in your own armchair. And also, there are two dangers here. One is saying, I'm going to be your theologian for you. The other is I'm going to be happy sitting in my armchair while you're the theologian for me. And that's really the people who say, well, what about Auschwitz? When they ask that question as an answer, they're ending their, that they're answering, they're stating a question as an answer. You have no answer for me, and therefore I give, and therefore not only do I give up, but you must give up. Game, set, match. So next time somebody asks you, and first of all, again, you can't do it for yourself. This is the life's work that people have, telling your story in relationship to other people's stories. That's true in Israel now, where we have many different stories, that there is a Christian version of Joseph and his brothers, a Muslim version of Joseph and his brothers, and a Jewish version of Joseph and his brothers. And we all have to live together with the conflicts that they imply, because they have very different conceptions of the future. However, what they have in common is that they are all aspirational. They are all leading to the promise of a future. And that aspirational element has an ethics implicit in it. When I aspire to something, when I have a story of which I'm a part, which takes me into the future, which promises the future for the individual or for the nation, that future, that ideal affects who I am now. Joseph does not sit in the church with those gloomy souls. Joseph sits in the church with those who can manage the serene delight and who can grasp that profound knowledge when rereading the story together with Mai in laughter and tears. Thanks for being around for that. We'll maybe have another in this series on theodicy.